Hi, welcome back. This is lesson 5 in the Early World Civilizations Read Aloud series. This is the people of the Nile. While people were creating cities and nations in Mesopotamia, another group of people, the Egyptians, were building another great civilization on the banks of another river, the Nile. The Nile River is the longest and one of the mightiest rivers on the earth. After it flows all the way through Egypt, it empties into the sea. The Nile has always given the people of Egypt a special advantage. Most farmers outside of Egypt had a hard time growing crops. They often had to farm the same land year after year. The problem with this was that by using the same land year after year, the crops they planted would use up the natural vitamins and minerals in that land. And after the vitamins and minerals were used up, the farmers could no longer grow crops on that land. So the farmers would have to stop farming and give the land a few years to rest. By not growing crops on that land for a few years, the natural vitamins and minerals the plants needed to grow would start to build up again. Then the farmers could farm on that land again, at least for a few more years. Because the farmers could only grow their crops on the same land for a few years before the natural vitamins and minerals would be used up, they could not count on being able to grow enough food every single year. It was a very hard life. But the Egyptians could farm the same land over and over again. Do you know why? The reason they could had to do with the Nile. The Nile begins its long journey to the sea in the high mountains of Central Africa. Every spring, heavy rainstorms fill Africa's mountain lakes, emptying water into the Nile. Rushing down the mountainsides with enormous speed and power, the swollen river carries mud, rich with minerals and vitamins, in its current. When the floodwaters reach the flatlands of Egypt, they spread out for miles on either side of the riverbanks. When the rains and the flooding stop, the river goes back to its usual size. Long ago, the ancient Egyptians planted crops in the muddy fields that were enriched with vitamins and minerals. In this way, the Nile floods meant life for the Egyptians. But if the rains were light for a year or two, the floodwaters would not bring enough rich soil with vitamins and minerals for the plants. And the people might go hungry because they would not be able to grow as much food. The Egyptians knew their lives depended on the river. Most Egyptians lived within 12 or 13 miles of the Nile on one side or the other, for it was there that the floodwaters refreshed the land each year. The floodwaters could also be very dangerous. When the spring floods came, the Nile could destroy homes and villages if they were built too close to the river. So many ancient Egyptian villages were built up above the level of the river, so that when the spring floods came, the river would not destroy the buildings and homes. Some villages, though, were built on the same level as the river itself. Every year, the people living there would have to leave their village when the water rose too high. They moved away to a safer place and then would return a few weeks later after the river had returned to a lower level. The ancient Egyptians in those villages would have to repair a lot of damage. Still, they did that every single year. Some villages had another way of dealing with the floodwaters. The people living in these villages dug canals, ditches cut into the earth that spread from the edge of the river to carry away the extra water from the spring floods. The water flowed through the canals, past the village, and into the farm fields beyond. So the village did not get damaged, and the water could not, or it could be, transported out further from the Nile. But the Egyptians used the Nile for other reasons, as we shall see in the story of an ancient Egyptian family. One day, thousands of years ago, an Egyptian woman named Ipia and her daughter, Meret, went down to the Nile to gather some soft, muddy clay so that they could make clay pots. Approaching the river, they heard a voice call, Ip, Meret. They looked up and smiled, for sailing out in the middle of the Nile was Rinsi, the husband of Ip and the father of Meret. Rinsi was a fisherman who sailed his narrow boat up and down the river, casting out rope nets to catch fish. Rinsi did this just as the men in his family had always done before him. As Rinsi's mother had told him, once a fisherman, always a fisherman, and once a fisherman's son, always a fisherman too. Rinsi began making his way back to Meret and Ip, and after a few minutes he reached the shore. Pulling his boat a little way onto the sand so that it would not drift back into the water, he made his way over to them. Meret turned to her father, who hugged her and kissed her. "Little fish," he said gently, using one of his nicknames for Meret. The three of them took the rope fishing nets from the boat and hung them to dry on wooden racks in the sun. Then Rinsi, his wife, and his daughter took the fish from the boat back to their village, where they would sell them at the market. That night, exhausted from a day at the market, they made their way back to their little house made of mud bricks at the edge of the village. That is all for this lesson. I'll see you at lesson 6.